It might be kind of a thin crowd today. We've had some people who are sick who are back, some people who are sick who are still sick, or some people who might be new to all of that sick list. I mentioned on Wednesday night, I think in kind of conjunction to Cade's statements from past Sunday mornings, based on my shorter stature and my need for glasses, I am not Cade Blunt. If you were out here for our class last week, he filled in and talked about the Old Testament, did a great job related to that. Appreciate Cade while I was sick last week filling in for all the lessons and for teaching the class. But we'll get back into our class on Christian evidences and Christian apologetics this morning. We're going to just forego our second class from last week and just move on with our topic of morality today. But that we do need to finish something we had from our class 2 weeks ago. And I know it's not good to start a class with conclusion. I recognize from a teaching perspective that's not the best place to begin. But we need to wrap up some things what we talked about with that class. So just to briefly summarize, if I can get 40 seconds of this in here. In that particular class, we talked about creation and evolution, looking to kind of think about the questions and do our best to say what is the best explanation for where does matter come from and where does life come from. A naturalist and evolutionist is going to have a very different set of view and answers on that than somebody who comes with a supernatural or a Christian worldview from that perspective. Patrick, I think it was that class, brought up the idea of just the question that needs to be thought of from time to time of why is there anything at all kind of relates to that. And some people will say that happens just over time and chance. Some people will say that there's God's design and God's handiwork and all of that. That's what the Bible teaches and the truth of God's Word teaches. So as we think about those questions, just what causes the universe, how did life come into the universe, Genesis 1:1, which is a great question we'll use with the kids for some suckers back there. If I can at least get started, most of them can finish it. In the beginning, can you all finish it? Not suckers for this morning, but can you all finish? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We see the beginning of that process. We see what happens in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, lead to the existence of everything. But the other side of that is evolution. Again, that happened, that chance, that over billions of years. Not necessarily saying that matter has always existed, because it doesn't seem to point to that being the fact or the reality. But if matter came into existence at some point, there was some type of cause, a big bang, something just happened millions or billions of years ago to lead everything and every life into existence. This one statement from a particular evolutionist makes the point, evolution is unproved and unprovable, but we believe it because the only alternative is special creation, and that is unthinkable. I obviously do not agree with that conclusion at all, but I can at least somewhat respect someone's very upfrontedness to say that when I consider the options of a naturalistic viewpoint or a supernaturalistic viewpoint, I just can't accept the idea that supernatural things exist, that there is a God who brought all this into being, so I'm going to choose this side instead. That probably makes things very difficult to have a profitable, well-leading conversation with somebody in that regard, but we can at least recognize and see someone has made a choice. But as we consider the weight and the evidences, as we did in that class, and as we'll from time to time in other places think about, is the evidence pointing to a creator who has designed these things, who is the uncaused cause of all of it, who is beyond time and space that can bring time and space into being, or is it just time and chance? And based on that evidence, we need to consider that question of what am I going to choose in that regard? Am I going to say I can't accept someone else being in control of my life and being in control of what I should do or shouldn't do with this life? And even as we'll talk about today with related to morality and how I choose to live my life and how I see what's right and what's wrong? Or do I accept the fact that God is creator, that He is sustainer, that He is sovereign, that He is in control, and that I need to then submit to Him? And then from that, think about how I live my life going forward. That's the big conclusion from that particular class, kind of a conclusion that continues to come about, that even leads into our classes for today. These big questions we consider to think about, wrapping up thinking about God a little bit today. Obviously, we could spend probably the rest of the year talking about God and this perspective of evidences and apologetics. But why we believe in God, why do we believe that the Bible is God's Word, why do we believe that Jesus is the Son of God? These are big and important questions we need to consider and think about. And as we think about these questions, we need to look objectively at the evidence. We need to reason through that evidence. And after we do all of that, we ultimately have to make a choice in what we're going to do. Am I going to accept that God is sovereign? Am I going to accept that He's given us His authority, given us His will through His Word? Am I going to accept that His Son is now King and has all authority over all heaven and all earth? And that means that as He is King, then I am a subject to that king, and I need to submit to him in that regard. We need to think about those questions and how we consider these things in the realm of apologetics and evidences. This morning, as we continue to think about our class, that the fact that there is a God, we do want to think about morality, thinking about right and wrong. We'll think about our objectives up here in a second, but before we do that, I'm going to vamp for just another second or so, and then Danny's going to lead us in prayer. Go ahead, brother, if you would lead us in prayer as we begin our class together this morning.
Most gracious Heavenly Father, we come before you this time, thanking you for this day and all the many blessings. We thank you for this church and our church family here. We pray that you be with the ones that are unable to be here today, the ones that are traveling. Father, we ask that you be with the teachers. We pray that they have a ready recollection of the things they prepared for us, and be with us as students who accept your word. Forgive us when we fall short. In Christ's name, amen.
So this morning, as we think about God, as we think about morality, still within these first 7 lessons, or I know that we skipped a lesson from last week, and we're just moving right along into the 7th lesson. We think about these questions or these classes related to God, and really think about his existence and kind of evidences that point to his existence, and looking at that evidence and seeing, is it reasonable to conclude that God exists or not? Think about that from the moral perspective. And one of those is just the classic moral argument that we'll talk about in just a moment. We mentioned it briefly in lesson 2, but that's been a little bit, and we want to really dive into that subject more today. We want to really discuss how we know what is right and wrong. Now, how do I have an understanding or a basis to say something is right or something is wrong? Is there ways that people try to come to those conclusions or rationalize that? How does God help us to know what is right and what is wrong according to his word and what we know about him? And why does that point to the fact that he really exists and is there as well? And then finally, we want to show how the subject of human suffering does not toss aside these claims, but rather best explains and is processed within the Christian worldview. Human suffering, morality, both those are fairly big topics this morning, but both of those intersect at least at some point on the Venn diagram. And when you think about the discussion for, does God exist? Well, if God exists and if he is all good and all powerful, how can there be suffering that humans face in this world? If God really did love humans, then why is there suffering at all? I don't plan to answer every single question on that. There continues to be questions about that. There continues to be discussions, and especially when it gets to the personal aspect of that. I'm not sure we can ever truly answer the specifics, maybe not with 100% certainty, but why am I specifically suffering in maybe this particular way? That's very hard to figure out. But I think we can talk about the subject this morning in a biblical perspective and also see how the fact that human suffering is in the world points to us wanting God and needing God and pointing to the fact that if he is there, then we should go to him and fling to him, or should cling to him as we follow him. So let's begin by just thinking about the moral argument for God. Just getting our first objective right out of the way for our lesson today. The moral argument, put in kind of this logic formula, goes like this. The first premise is the fact that if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. We understand that claim that's being made, that proposition here. The second proposition being that objective moral values do exist. We recognize that there is an objective moral value, and we're going to even define that more in just a second. But the idea that we understand right and wrong, and it seems to be more than just it's what's right to me and what's right for you. That everyone agrees that there is right and wrong. Now, there will be some things they differ on. There will probably be some people who reject that system, but there does seem to be an objective moral value system. And thus the conclusion from that would be that God does exist. That if there are moral values and there are an objective moral values, then God must be behind all of that, is the claim we're looking to substantiate today. Ms. Eva, is that you getting that from the notes? I know you're taking notes. I'm about to change it, so I don't want to go too fast.
Go ahead.
All righty. Okay. That's all right. I know you're trying to take some good notes. I want everybody to know today, at the end of our class, depending on how things go today, I'm going to punch Ms. Eva in the face as hard as I can, all right? And we need to decide before we've got the next 40 minutes to decide, am I going to punch this lady in the face as hard as I can or not? Is that an issue or not? So Tracy, be ready to jump your mom and to help her out if we need to be, but I think that we're probably going to be all right. Let's see what we can figure out about that, though. Is that wrong to punch someone in the face, someone who might be defenseless, someone who might be a caring kind of person? How do we come to that conclusion of something like that being wrong, to physically harm someone, get even some more serious, to take the life of somebody, to violate somebody? You maybe are conscious being involved in that. We'll put a pin in that. We might get a chance to bring that up later, Miss Glinda. We'll come to maybe some conscious stuff in a bit. So how do we know right and wrong? How do I know even before class and even before the next 40 minutes that I'm not going to punch Miss Eva in the face, other than the fact that one of our elders and her son is sitting right there, and he's a football coach, and I'm sure he could take this band kid down pretty easily. Even beyond all of that, just knowing that that is the wrong thing to do. How do we know that? How do we understand that is wrong? Does objective morality, this sense of right and wrong that's outside of ourselves, not from within ourselves, not even just my conscience. It's not just my conscience that says this is right or wrong. Our conscience is a big part of that, but something outside of us says it's wrong to do harm to another person. It's wrong to take the life of a human being. It's wrong to abuse someone, to sexually mistreat them. These type of things we hear going on in our world, we say that's injustice, that's evil. How do we have an ability to label those things and to understand that is wrong or something is good? The thing about the naturalist perspective that we kind of have been thinking about from time to time and wanting to try to do our best to give them their fair voice and representation here, the naturalists will believe that life and matter came into being by chance. And it seems they're going to struggle to answer this question, I would think. The idea that they're going to reject objective morality as a whole, the fact that there isn't a complete sense of what's right and what's wrong, but something might be right for you, but it's not right for me, or something might be wrong to you, but that doesn't bother me. And so that's kind of just a toss in the air. We'll use the term relativism, talk about that more in just a second. And maybe, or with that, or maybe and along with that, comes with the fact that something that wasn't moral turned into a moral order. You know, if we go with the evolutionist perspective of non-life matter end up bringing about life kind of matter. I know that this isn't the perspective, but the idea that this bench is going to somehow come into a conscious and a being and say, it's wrong for me to have this hard of a back, and so I need to adapt and to evolve and to change, and that's uncomfortable for some. I'm harming someone. We're doing all right with our benches. There are people who don't even have benches, so we're thankful for that. But you think about the fact that this bench is not going to come to some type of conscious being to say, this is wrong for me to do something, or that I'm going to have some type of involvement in some way. Matter doesn't go from non-moral, non-life matter to life matter, moral order kind of matter in that way. So how does somebody who comes from a naturalist perspective think about right and wrong? These following lifestyles and philosophies can be very helpful just to be aware of as you might be talking to someone in this regard. Maybe we've heard the term of hedonism before. Just this idea of life should be just about pursuing pleasure and pursuing happiness, pursuing things that make me feel good, especially that pleasure of the senses. And so if that's how society should run, or if that's how I run my life, and that's how you run your life, how do we get along? Well, maybe there's some things we mutually agree upon. We both agree that Chick-fil-A makes the best chicken sandwiches, so we continue to support that business and go eat at that establishment. But something might bring me pleasure that might harm you in some way. And with that type of lifestyle, might be, well, it brings me pleasure, and so there's nothing wrong with that. I want to understand, even most people who come from a non-believing God kind of worldview recognize the danger of that or the issue with that. That if all of society lived in that way, it's just chaos. And obviously, that chaos is not what's wanted. But even, how can we use a word like chaos in that regard if all of it's relative and it doesn't matter in that regard? Along with that is also the utilitarianism. I'm not going to be able to say it, but the utility of a person. The value of a thing or an action is determined by its utility. And all action must be thought of what's best for the greatest number of people. The way society sometimes treat the older or the younger generations of people, The older people, you've been productive, you've provided some things for a time, but now you're just kind of sucking the life out of things, and the care that we provide for you isn't as important as we want to provide to somebody who's young and active and has a future ahead of them where your future is not as important. Or somebody who's a younger person, you don't really bring much to the table, so the way people look at kids, they think, I'm not really going to be giving you much attention or much thought in this regard. Obviously, there's much more to life than just what someone can bring to the table. Just the fact that someone has that life shows that they have value and are important. Think about what Jesus says in Mark chapter 10. Let's get a little bit of Bible in our Bible class this morning. Mark chapter 10. Start with me in verse 13. Mark chapter 10 and verse 13. Mark 10:13. People were bringing little children to him in order that he might touch them, but the disciples rebuked them. When Jesus saw it, he was indignant and said to them, "Let the little children come to me. Do not stop them, because the kingdom of God belongs to such as these." There can be a time or a danger for people, and we even sometimes see it in the religious world and even in the world of different Christian denominations, where you've got grown-up church, and then you've got kid church, and then you've got kind of like little kid church. You know, the little kids, maybe elementary school and below, they go and they're just out there with some type of youth person who's well-trained to work with children and help them to try to maybe learn a little bit about Jesus in that regard, but they're just going to get in the way of the adults who are trying to worship and pay attention to the sermon. I think probably every parent in here can relate to that at some point, to say, you know, it might be kind of nice if I could just shove my kid in a room somewhere so I actually listen for 40 minutes and could actually partake of communion without having other thoughts in my mind of what's my kid doing right now, or what is that stain on the floor, or where are all these crumbs coming from. People think we can just get rid of that, we'll separate, and these kids, when they get older, when they mature, and they bring some value and they can learn to behave themselves, then they can join big church and they can be part of that. You can see maybe how that sounds appealing, but you can also recognize that's not how Jesus felt about children. He saw value in children. In a society, even in the first century, when they would see children as kind of, let's get early and to raise you to a time that you can actually do some work and provide and help this family, Jesus says, children are important. Don't shun them away from me, but even bring them to me in that regard. So the utilitarianism view of people and of life just does not match with how we should treat one another and how we would treat another person, the morals we would use or the ethical values we would use in treating somebody else. If you go down this path of everything is just random chance, that we're here today because billions of years ago the right atoms or the right molecules came together to make the first substance or energy, and all that energy just happened to get into a point that now I have flesh and bones, but beyond that, there's just really nothing. You get to that nihilism type of viewpoint, that nothing really matters. Imagine if everybody goes around with that perspective. Nothing matters. The idea that whatever I do doesn't have consequences, whatever I do doesn't lead me to any type of important value or worth, that I can do good for somebody, but it's not going to lead to anything productive, that the good of society doesn't even really matter. That's a very bleak and very kind of far view, kind of very extreme view, I think that's what I'm trying to say, that people sometimes hold. But people look at that perspective. A lot of times that comes from the fact that there's no God, there's no thing beyond this life, there's no consequences, there's no judgment, there's no sustainer, there's no sovereign. We have to acknowledge ourselves to. There's a lot of problems in that regard. And maybe the most common thought of all of these philosophies and lifestyles is this idea that relativism, that truth and moral values are not absolute, but they're relative to people who hold him. You know, maybe the other 40, 50 people in this room feel it's wrong for me to punch a woman in the face, but maybe I don't really have an issue with that. Maybe I've had problems with older ladies in my life before, and so every older lady I see, I'm just punching them and decking them everywhere I go. And for me, that's not a big deal. That's obviously a problem. Also, not trying to insinuate anything. Our young sister here, recognize we appreciate her very much. So all of these philosophies of how a naturalist comes to how we have morals and how we define morals, just it makes it very difficult to answer that question when we take God out of the equation. A couple of statements kind of going against this or thinking against this conclusion that a naturalist can come to understanding morality and what morality would be. Man, with that evolved mass of cerebral tissue between his ears, somehow is capable of discovering moral truth. think that if there really is we're going to have morals that evolved over time, that society has kind of, with evolution as well, brought about morals into being, and that morals are part of our genes that come into existence. How did we come up with that? How did people who still sometimes push on doors that say pull come to understand that this is right and this is wrong? How did we come to those conclusions? Why should he be, since no other animal on the long, meandering evolutionary chain locate that and live by that moral truth? And secondly, that if morality is man-authorized, I could see that it is utterly impossible to argue for any singular system of ethics in which one could consistently argue his fellows to subscribe. If I'm preaching that, we need to do things the Bible way, and that somebody might say that's fine for you, but that's not something that I have to adhere to, and that person has their own set of moral values, but that means that's not what Glow has to adhere to, and that if I want to live my life in my own type of moral way, I can do whatever I want, but if it's man-authorized, then each man authorizes their own morality. But what we're talking about when we think about this from the Scripture's perspective, to recognize and see that God authorizes what is right and what is wrong. It comes from his character and who he is. For the naturals to be able to call anything right or wrong or fair or evil or good or etc., any of those terms, they'd have to steal the system and the ideas for right and wrong from God. Let me pause there before we get into our text that we have up on screen. I think you're already in Mark chapter 10. We'll be in Mark 10:18 in just a second. Comments or questions about things so far? We got one hand here. Patrick, go ahead.
This kind of is simple. Organisms running around just trying to survive, just trying to, one, reproduce so that my genes get into the next generation. Why is it everywhere?
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's just like, why is there anything? Why do we ever even come up with the ideas of good and bad? And when you look at it, no matter kind of the areas that you look at it, it's always things that are bad or things that injure or harm other people.
Right.
So it's just, to me, it's one of those things that it's like, why is there anything? When you get to moral questions, why are there moral questions? Because if we're just evolving and nothing really matters, it's really hard pressed to come up with why does a little society over here that's still in some isolation down in South America and in the Amazon, why do they have a moral code?
Mm-hmm.
Why?
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't really make sense to say that, well, we just discovered. Well, why did we have the ability to discover? I mean, it's a never-ending story at that point.
Right.
You go back and you just ask the fundamental question. Why you're worried about where did stuff come from? I'm wondering why is there anything at all?
Right.
We're
Absolutely.
getting to, well, we can have situational ethics and situational morals and all this other. I just want to know where the morals come from to begin with.
Yeah. And before we get to Audrey, the idea that Patrick is saying here, the law may be different in another country in the other side of the world, but there's still a law for how we treat one another. And that idea of we need to have a law of how we treat, does that just come from our common ancestor of who we are as humans? Well, where did that person or those first beings get that from? Those are those deep questions. And again, I think I missed sticking in it earlier, so I'm going to stick it in here. Just because somebody may have a view of life that they don't accept God doesn't mean that they can't be a moral person. But again, it's coming to that question of, why are you being moral? Why even be moral if none of this really matters? It's very hard to not almost get down that path to nihilism then and just say, well, it doesn't matter. And I'm just going to either be an awful person to other people, or I'm just going to be someone who does absolutely nothing and apathetic in that regard. I'm going to get Audrey and then Jeff. Audrey?
I just think it's another obvious evidence that we were made in that is what he is. So therefore, from the beginning, we just have a want and a natural desire to be good and to want just for all humanity.
Absolutely. I think the evidences that we're thinking about here are saying it's pointing us towards that existence of God and him being there. And that continues to then, as we ponder down the questions over the next few weeks of, well then, if he's the one who's there, what has he said? That's his word. What does he decree for us to do? That's Jesus and following, submitting to him. But recognizing that there are things that point to his existence. So when we have conversations, when people throw accusations against us from atheists or agnostics or other places, people might say that it's ridiculous to believe in God, that we feel confident to say, no, I feel strong in what I believe. That's saying that God does exist. And there might be hard why questions that we can all sit around in comfy leather chairs for forever and ponder forever about and come to different conclusions based on our own thoughts, but there are evidences that do point to God. I think there are strong evidence of that. Jeff, go ahead.
Some people in here are old enough to remember the movie Breakfast at Tiffany's. The Audrey Hepburn character in that movie is named Holly Golightly, and she's sort of your classic nihilist. The whole movie, to me, is about this. How do we actually have values? She doesn't want to get involved with anybody. She doesn't want to care about anybody. She doesn't want to care about anything. She just lives this very superficial life that is all hedonistic. And what breaks her is a stray cat that sort of adopts her and then goes missing. And she realizes that she loves the cat. And she can't stand the fact that it's going to be lost and die. And so she goes and finds it in the rain. This is the climax of the movie, that she's actually been able to care about something. And I feel like love is the basic.
Absolutely. I mean, think about the basics that go to what the greatest commands of loving God and loving our neighbor. This is a lot of that idea of loving our neighbor. It comes from one, understanding who God is and loving him, but how we treat our neighbor then comes from how God tells us to treat our neighbor, and that we would show that person love and care, and that we would show kindness and compassion and mercy to those people as we have opportunities to do so. Staying in Mark chapter 10, let's get some of these passages up here and finish this slide before we go to our final section this morning. Mark chapter 10 and verse 18. Jesus is speaking to the rich young ruler. He's asked him in verse 17, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus says, "Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone." Even as I stumble my way through that text, hopefully you get the point that Jesus is not saying, I'm not God, but the point is he is saying that God is good and that I accept the fact that I am a good teacher, that I am good. We recognize that goodness starts with God and who he is and just his nature and his character, and that he calls us to be like him in that regard. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 15 and verse 16. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 15 and verse 16. "But as the one who called you is holy, you also are to be holy in all your conduct. For it is written, 'Be holy, because I am holy.'" Peter uses a quotation from Leviticus here to make the point that God is holy and that he does good, and that from that he expects his creation to be good and holy. Those who are the exiles that Peter is writing to, that are following in God's footsteps, that are trying to live their lives according to the ways that God has called them, even as they face suffering in this world, begins with this grand reminder: be holy like God is holy. Let that influence how you live your life. God's existence, this comes from the book Reasons to Believe in God, or Is It Reasonable to Believe in God? I think many of you know Bruce Reeves. I think he's done that series here with Tyler and Sean and Shane. Maybe some of you have been here for that. But Bruce, in his chapter of that book, which is based on some of that series they've done on evidences, makes the point in this white box you see on the screen: God's existence is a logical necessity because we need to know what counts as good and evil. And people have some type of standard to say, this is good and this is evil. But how am I saying that this over here gets to be evil and this over here gets to be good? And how do I know what counts in that regard? We need to know what we ought to do and what we ought not to do. And thirdly, we need to know how we are accountable for our moral actions and decisions. These are things that I think every person feels, and maybe people who don't because they choose to reject the idea that they come from God, they come from a society that has morals, or they reject those morals and those standards of society, and so they are different because of the choices they make. But within that, there's evidence to pointing that I need to know what's right and wrong, and I have a feeling I need to know what's right and wrong, and what that means, the consequences that come from that pointing to the existence of God. Ms. Rhonda, go ahead.
I just think it's really good at this point just to throw in what the word holy actually means. You know, it's not like perfect, but it's set apart for a specific purpose, or set apart to be consecrated basically to God. It's set apart. So your purpose, your intent, your walk is not necessarily perfect as individuals, but it is set apart as God sets us apart with Him in the relationship that we have. So that's our purpose, that's our intent.
Our purpose is to live life the way God has called us to live, to be those priests, to be the people that are reaching out to Him, and to be the people who would glorify Him even in the difficulties of life. But we're separated for what God has called us to do. We just need to live according to His Word and follow that. But as we do all of that, the kind of going back to the beginning of our class when we use the moral argument for God, if God does not exist, then there would be no moral objective standard. There obviously seems to be a moral objective standard. We're seeing evidence for that, and so God does exist. Someone will use that idea with this subject of suffering, and this question of how do we explain suffering. The first premise would go from somebody that if God exists, there would be no evil in the world, no evil, no suffering. The second premise that they see then is the fact that there is evil. There is human sex trafficking that goes on. There is murder. There is rape. There is abuse by governmental powers. There is abuse just in the homes and families and people who are in corporations. There's evil of people who take advantage of others and rob and steal other people. There's evil in the world. So the conclusion they come to is that God just does not exist then. That's the logical progression from that. The box looks something kind of like this. The two bolded statements up at the top, God is all good and God is not all good, compared with God is all powerful and God is not all powerful. That middle box right there, not that conclusion, but that's where we would live as Christians, that we believe God is all good and we believe that God is all powerful. That's not just the only things that we would know about God or say about God, but we believe that about God. He is good, just as Audrey talked about a little while ago. He is all-powerful. He's brought everything into being. To think about the other part of the boxes, though, if God is all-powerful and on the far right God is not all good, then God just doesn't care about evil in the world, and He just turns a blind eye to it. The maybe kind of deistic view that God wound up the clock and just said, let it go, and He doesn't care about His creation at all. Down at the bottom, you have if God is all good, and that very middle box at the bottom, God is not all powerful. Maybe God does care about us, God does love us, but He's just not strong enough to deal with the evil in the world, and so He's weak and inferior and not who we think that He really is, and really not a God that's worth serving. And particularly if God is not all good and God is not all powerful, then we have really no business worshiping Him or trying to serve Him or call Him to be God. But we do believe Him to be all good. We do believe Him to be all powerful. The conclusion from here, for someone who doesn't believe in God, would be, well, evil must not exist or God doesn't exist. That if God really is all good, He would just erase all suffering and all evil. But even from that goes back to our class from a moment ago, the top left box up there, how are we defining evil without God? If we're removing God from the equation, then how can we even say something is evil? And if we're also trying to make the claim that God doesn't exist, but yet we're using the standards that He uses as far as good and evil, does that make sense? People are saying that God is evil, but they're also trying to make the point that God doesn't exist. Well, then how does evil exist? You see some of the circular fallacies in that regard. So to think about some of that, how do we explain suffering? I don't know if in 14 minutes I can explain everything about suffering, but I think we can get a point to see that human suffering does not toss out the moral argument we make for God, nor does it toss out the fact that we should give up on God. But I think rather it gives a good explanation about why Christians believe in God and why we should go closer to God in times of suffering rather than farther away from Him, Suffering, as you think about it being talked about in Scripture, can be from a number of situations. Again, right now I'm not thinking about your specific suffering or my specific suffering. I'm facing this one very specific thing of suffering. Why is that going on? Which of these reasons can I pin it down to? I may not be able to do that, but we could see a variety of sources for why suffering comes into the life of human beings. In 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 1 through verse 15, the prophet Nathan is talking to David and tells him about how he's going to have a child that's going to die, how there's going to be lots of problems in his family going forward. Why is all of this going to be happening in David's life? In 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 1 through 15, why is this child going to die? Why is it that his kids in the future, other than this child, are going to be facing lots of bloodshed and violence amongst one another? What's happened in the previous chapter?
The sin of David.
The sin with Bathsheba and the sin he committed there, and his refusal to repent of that sin in that regard. So Nathan goes to David and rebukes him and tells him that God is going to punish him for the choices that he's made. There's a very specific and clear example to see that sin has led to a punishment. But sometimes suffering comes into the world just because human beings voluntarily choose to violate the kindness or the love we're supposed to show one another. That we as created beings have free will to decide to do good or to do evil. And God leaves us up to our choices to either accept him and his teachings and to walk that path of holiness and good that he calls us to, or I can say, forget that, I'm going to go my own way and enjoy the pleasures of life that I want to have in that regard. 1 John chapter 3, verse 12 speaks to this a little bit. 1 John chapter 3 and verse 12. 1 John 3 and verse 12. I'm going to catch verse 11 just to include a little bit of context here. For this message you have heard from the beginning, we should love one another. Unlike Cain, 1 John 3:12, who was of the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his deeds were evil and his brothers were righteous. Cain did not have that brotherly love of not just his physical brother, but his brother, mankind and creation as well. And understand that when we have that type of mentality that we don't care for our brother, we end up mistreating them. And what does God call that? He calls that evil, because I make a choice to punch somebody in the face when they don't deserve it, and that I should not live in that way. That brings about suffering. That brings about pain in someone else's life. We see suffering can be from redemptive and renewing type of perspective. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, suffering is in this world as it brings about, points us to the redemptive work of God and points to a renewing that we need to think about in our lives, in our hearts, in our souls. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 16 through verse 18. Therefore we do not give up. Even though our outer person is being destroyed, our inner person is being renewed day by day. For our momentary light affliction is producing for us an absolutely incomparable eternal weight of glory. So we do not focus on what is seen, but on what is unseen. For we have seen the temporary, what is unseen is eternal. A lot of the verses of the Psalms, a lot of the statements of the prophets, statements of people like Job, who we'll talk about more, he's up on the screen at the bottom there, but we'll talk about just very briefly in a second. People who recognize that in this moment of suffering that's going on, it's pushing me closer to God, to trust in him, to recognize that there is an unseen beyond what I'm seeing right now. I'm seeing the suffering, but I know there is something beyond the suffering, and I need to hold on to and to cling to that. That language we see sometimes in Scripture, that verbiage of clinging to God in those moments is so important. The phrase I had to remind myself, because I always butcher the quote, but I think I've got it finally, of the same sun that hardens the clay softens the wax. The idea that some people who face suffering and they say, God, this is your fault. I hate you for allowing this suffering in my life. If you really loved me, you would have never allowed this to take place. Obviously, you don't love me. I'm done. I'm giving up on you. There are some people, as they're facing suffering, say, I'm going through this, and I don't know how to do this without you, God, and so they go closer to him and do cling to him in those troubling times. And that's what suffering can be pushing us to do as we face that suffering in our life. Suffering can be a test and a revelation of faith. In 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 6 through verse 9, it can be soul building. Let's get Acts chapter 14 and verse 22. Acts chapter 14 and verse 22. Acts chapter 14, if I can join you all there as well. and verse 22. Strengthening the disciples by encouraging them to continue in the faith and by telling them it is necessary to go through sunshines and rainbows to enter the kingdom of God. Who's talking here in verse 22? And I promise I'm going to correct my misreading in just a moment. But who's speaking this passage in Acts chapter 14, verse 22? Starts with a P, rhymes with Saul. How about that? Paul, thank you, Vanessa, for answering that question. All right, so Paul is speaking. What has Paul just experienced on this first preaching trip? Has he experienced just sunshine and rainbows going through this? There's been conversions. Yes, absolutely. Also, what's constantly been happening? Jews chasing him, running out of town. He's just been stoned almost to death. And he's going back to those same places and saying, and again, the mental picture I have, for what it's worth, you can have this picture if you want it to. This is for free. If you've been stoned, how does your face look? You walking back into town, the last time some of those people saw you, you looked like a normal person. Now it looks like you've been inside of a washing machine for a couple of cycles, and the dryer as well. You look all mangled and beat, and here's someone saying, keep following God. That is very enriching and building for those people to hear Paul say, I've gone through this, and you know what? To get back to our text, and so I can correct what I said earlier, verse 22, strengthening the disciples by encouraging them to continue in the faith and by telling them it is necessary to go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God. That you might look just like me, ugly nose and broken it all, and you might look like me with big ears and other problems too. But Paul says you need to continue to trust in the Lord as you go through this suffering, and that it's going to allow you to enter into the kingdom of God because you've been faithful to him. It's not just that I've gone through suffering and I've checked that box. It's not a checking a box thing. It's the fact that I've continued to put my faith and I put my trust in my God who provides and takes care of me. Even though people physically may harm me in this world, I continue to trust in him and to follow in his steps. And sometimes, again, just to end all of this off, of suffering can come from the source of, I just don't know. Deuteronomy 29:29, the secret things belong to the Lord. There's a lot of things, especially when it comes to personal, specific suffering. Why is this specific thing happening? Why is my spouse going through this? Why did I lose my child in this regard? Why is this person treating me in this way at work or at school all the time? There are some things that there might be just I don't knows, but there's along with that things we need to recognize and know about how God wants us to respond to those times of suffering. And that means that we need to be brothers and sisters in Christ who are doing our best to help those we know who are going through moments of suffering. To make sure, the phrase that I've heard just from moving to Texas that's been new but very favorite to me, make sure we're not people putting lipstick on a pig when it comes to helping our brother who's facing suffering. You know what that means, of putting lipstick on a pig? That the problem is still there and you're just trying to doll it up and say it's not a big deal. There might be things that you need to be more like the first week of Job's friends rather than the last 30 chapters of Job's friends, of just sit and shut up and help that person by being there with them rather than trying to explain things that you don't understand in that regard. There are some things that it's just difficult to help somebody who's in a moment of suffering. It can be very difficult and very hard. But God is with them in that, and God help us be with those people as well. Another quote up here, the story of Job shows that the question of who we serve in times of suffering is a far greater question than why we are experiencing suffering. That's a very mature, that's a very hard question or set of questions to set with. Again, especially when I'm the person going through that time of suffering. But that's what Scripture is teaching us and pointing us to. The question of, does God just not care? God just allows all this suffering to go on, especially he allows my suffering to go on, so he just must not care about us. John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And John 1:14, what did that Word do? That Word came and took on flesh. In John chapter 3 and verse 16, that Word who took on flesh did what? He was the one who would go and give his life. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believe in him should not perish, but have eternal life. And him giving his Son is not just saying, hey, here's the miracle worker who's going to feed all of your empty stomachs. Here's the one who's going to go to the cross and die where you should die instead. Does that sound like a God who doesn't care about his creation? Let's get 2 Peter together. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 9 through verse 13. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 9 through verse 13. Does God just not care about suffering? Does God just not care about his humanity? The bizarre, strange things about the teachings of the gospel. Something like what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5 about how we feel about not just our neighbors, but how we love our enemies too. So that's how God feels about his enemies. That reminds us of maybe Romans chapter 5. While we were still enemies, God showed his love for us by sending his son to die for us. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 9 through verse 13, God sees the people who are causing suffering in the lives of other people. And the fact that there are still worlds here, that we are still alive on this earth, means that there are some of those people that God is still giving time to change their lives and to repent. 2 Peter chapter 3, 9 through 13. The Lord does not delay his promise, as some understand delay, but is patient with you, not wanting any to perish, but all to come to repentance. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief, and on that day the heavens will pass away with a loud noise, the elements will burn and be dissolved, and the earth and all the works that are on it will be disclosed. Since all these things are to be dissolved in this way, it is clear what sort of people you should be in holy conduct and godliness. As you wait for the day of God and hasten its coming, because of the day the heavens will be dissolved with fire and the elements will melt with heat. But based on his promise, we wait for new heavens and a new earth where righteousness dwells. We can be very time-oriented people, and I like things to happen in my time. You're thinking, Jeff, don't go 5 minutes. We've only got 4 minutes left in class. We've got things to do. We've got time we need to be aware of. So as we think about the question, does God not care? Is God not doing anything about suffering? The question might be better stated, and maybe the answer is better stated, of God may not be doing anything yet, but we know that he will. We are confident. His promises says that he will redeem and help people, that he will bring about that reversal. People who are facing suffering will be the ones who find those who are bringing that suffering into their lives, facing those problems for themselves. It's not on the screen, but can I get 2 Thessalonians 1 for that? That's what I'm trying to quote, but not getting exactly here. 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 5. It is clear evidence of God's righteous judgment that you will be counted worthy of God's kingdom, for which you are also suffering. Verse 6 of 2 Thessalonians 1. Since it is just for God to repay with affliction those who afflict you. And God is dealing with that. In 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 9, he says it this way. The Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials and to keep the unrighteous under punishment for the day of judgment. I may be facing suffering, and there might be someone who's causing that, and I might think, why is God not doing anything about this right now? God is maybe, and again, I can't give a prescriptive answer for everybody in every situation in life, maybe helping build our faith as we're going through this moment of suffering right now. It may be that as we're going through this, we need to recognize and see the eternal perspective of things. That light momentary affliction of 2 Corinthians 4 sounds really great on a Sunday morning when we're probably generally doing okay. But on Thursday night, when we're thinking about our loved ones who cause us so much grief and heartache and pain because of the ways they choose to live their lives just in general, or maybe even how it affects us and hurts us, that light momentary affliction gets really, really heavy. And in those moments, we need to continue to go to the Lord. We are tempted to cry out, God does not care. We must think deeply about the truth that the Word became flesh, endured the terrible suffering of the cross to rescue us, and is coming again for his people. Thinking about morality as we kind of tie all this together, the idea that there's suffering, we would call that evil. Where do you even get the title for that? This quote from C.S. Lewis. My argument against God, Lewis, before writing about so much related to Christian thinking and the ways he came to following God, before that was an atheist. My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how did I get this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of what a straight line is. What was I comparing this universe to when I called it unjust? For the argument depended on saying the world was really unjust, not simply did not happen to please my fancies. And that's a very different perspective. If it's just, I don't like the way that God is, well, then own up to that, like the guy we mentioned at the beginning of class today. But if it's, I'm trying to find truth, recognize this evidence is pointing to the truth that God really does exist. And he wants us to live the ways he's called us in his word. He wants us to live because he's rescued us from that domain of darkness into the kingdom of his son. And that's the domain we need to follow and to live in. Hopefully, as we think about morality, as we have conversations with people about that, as we consider that for ourselves, we recognize and see that there is a God. The evidence points to that, and that we need to listen to his word. We'll talk about this more next week as we get into our class. Thank you so much for your presence and for your attention. Thank you so much, especially for our visitors who are here. We begin our worship here in about 10 minutes.